Welcome, brave souls, to Fear File Chronicles, your one-way ticket to spine-chilling stories and terrifying tales. Tonight, we'll be diving into the darkest corners of the human mind with the story, After the Fall, Part 2, penned by the twisted mind of Locked 334. Together, we'll explore the unexplained and face our deepest fears. But before we begin, if you enjoy trembling in terror, be sure to hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow fear fanatics and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click the bell notification so you never miss an eerie episode. Your support truly means the world to us. So feel free to leave a comment below to join the Fear File Chronicles community. Now, without further ado, let's unravel the mysteries of the unknown together as we delve into tonight's fear-inducing story, After the Fall, Part 2. Dim the lights and prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the Fear File Chronicles. Collin dreamed of January. His family huddled around the tiny kitchen table. His younger brother sat in front of a large chocolate cake adorned with 12 lit candles. They sang happy birthday, and their mother told Danny to make a wish. The young man's eyes glowed with excitement. He took in a deep breath and extinguished all the candles but one. The remaining candle made Danny frown. Collin leaned over and put it out with a huff.
"I didn't see it still lit. You got 'em all,"
he said with a chuckle. He was startled from his dream by the sound of an engine roaring to life. He shot up from the couch. Tony was no longer inside. He grabbed his pistol and rushed outside. A rusty old Chevy truck plowed through the field in front of him. Tony sat bouncing in the driver's seat with a grin from ear to ear. Collin bolted from the front steps, bounding across the field. He yelled for the boy to stop. His calls could not be heard over the truck. He finally came across the path and waved for Tony to stop. Tony's eyes shot open wide as he slammed on the brakes. The truck came to a stop, kicking up dust just a foot from Collin. He rushed to the driver's side, turned off the engine, and yanked Tony out.
"What in the hell do you think you are doing?"
Tony's eyes welled up.
"Just wanted to have a little fun. At this rate, I'm never going to get to drive a car, and I don't know why you don't. It would be a lot better than walking everywhere."
"Listen, I didn't get to practice enough before all this shit happened. Plus, don't you think all that racket is bound to draw some attention?"
His words were stopped in his throat by the sound of another truck. Collin had been right, and someone now knew where they were. He quickly jerked Tony up and began running for the house. Within moments, the door shut behind them and they tossed their things into their bags. Collin peered out the window. A huge four-wheel drive had stopped outside the farmhouse. There were two men inside and two more, standing in the bed of it, holding rifles. They all climbed down and began calling for the two to come out. They had already been spotted, and now they were trapped inside. Collin whispered for the boy to follow him upstairs. They crept slowly up the wood planks. They made their way to a bedroom that overlooked the men. Then Collin instructed Tony to go to the side window and open it. As the boy did this, Collin brought his rifle up to aim. He peered down the scope and dropped the reticle at about neck level of one of the gunmen. Collin told Tony to let off a few rounds as soon as he took his shot. He squeezed the trigger slowly, remembering to exhale as he drew it all the way back. The crack of the rifle caused Tony to jump. His finger jammed down on the trigger of the pistol again and again. The first man fell to the ground, blood spurting from the side of his neck. The other men scattered at the repeated popping of the pistol. They attempted to seek cover behind their truck, but Collin was already trained in on the next one. The bolt dropped the next round in place, and he fired. A round went through the next one's chest. Another round chambered and fired within seconds, shattering the driver's knee as he tried to run. The last had made a dash across the field, but Collin's last round buried deep in the back of his skull before passing through the other side. When he lowered the rifle, Tony was still clicking away at the pistol. He had no ammo left in the clip. Collin took the pistol from Tony's hands. He shoved it back in the holster he had stolen. He guided the boy downstairs. They exited the front door to see that the driver was still trying to crawl for his truck. Tony was told to remain on the porch as Collin approached the injured man. He stood over him for a moment. The man rolled over to come face to face with Collin's rifle. A final shot rang out in the open field. Then the two gathered their belongings and started their trek back to the road in silence. An hour later, Tony attempted to apologize.
I'm sorry.
Collin stopped walking. Without even looking back to the boy, he began yelling,
If you want to survive, you're going to have to listen to what I say and start acting less like a little kid. If you keep running around and joking about this situation, you're going to be dead, Danny.
Then he started walking again, leaving Tony speechless behind him. Tony kept his distance for the rest of the day. They did not even speak during meals or breaks. It was the longest day either of them could remember. By the time they came to rest at a deserted diner, they were simply ready to call it a night. Collin closed his eyes, his pistol resting in his lap. Tony sat across from him, staring at the pistol for a few moments. He had never seen anyone act like Collin did. Questions bubbled up inside him. One question in particular.
You called me Danny.
Collin peeked out to the boy.
What?
Back on the road today, you called me Danny? Who is Danny?
Collin shook his head for a moment.
Don't worry about it.
Tony was afraid to push Collin anymore. He knew it would just make things worse. He shuffled against his backpack and tried to get comfortable as the sun disappeared over the horizon. Collin turned away from the boy. He felt the salty tears form at the corner of his eyes. The two of them lay in silence for hours before they could actually fall asleep. When both drifted off to a restless sleep, they dreamed of the same thing. And it wasn't birthday cake or presents. Collin simply nudged the boy awake with his boot and tossed him his backpack. He had already been up for a couple of hours. He had stocked up on what few things were still edible from the diner. They began walking again and found themselves passing through a tiny neighborhood. Each house looked similar, yet minor differences drew their attention. They both quietly admired the change of scenery. It had been all trees for quite some time. Collin's eyes trained on the windows most of all, his rifle in hand. Tony had even kept a pistol in his pocket now, knowing danger could be around any corner. They had both become hardened by this world, even though neither of them were truly ready for it. Then Collin's eyes came to rest on something laying in the grass. It was shiny and new, even though it was more of a purple than the blue one he had. He slowly picked up the bicycle, pressing on the tires to check for air. They were firm, and he knew they could use it to move a little quicker. He waved Tony over and sat on the seat, then gestured for Tony to hop on the back pegs. The two of them began rolling down the hill. The breeze on their faces reminded them of a better time. Collin wanted to yell out with excitement, but he knew it would be a bad idea. When the hill tapered off, the bike came to a stop at a sign that read, 30 miles to Charlotte. Collin's fun had been dampened at the thought. He simply pulled out his map. They would need to turn north to avoid the city. He began plotting a path. Tony slipped off the bike and walked over in front of it. He reached up and pulled the paper down so that Collin could see him.
Do you feel like talking to me now?
The boy said in an almost bashful tone.
Just didn't have anything to say.
Collin replied before pulling his map back up.
You could start by telling me who Danny is.
Collin closed the atlas and shoved it back in his satchel with a sigh. He rubbed at his eyes and tried to think of the right words. He tried not to think about his little brother, but Tony was a constant reminder of his mistakes. He wanted to tell Tony the truth and just get it out. It was the first time he even had someone to talk to in months. Collin was simply afraid that Tony might leave and never come back.
He was my little brother, about your age, actually.
He finally let it slip.
Was?
Tony's face wrinkled in confusion for a moment, but soon realized his mistake.
I'm sorry. What happened to him?
He died.
Collin replied before looking at the ground where his foot kicked at the asphalt.
Before or after?
The boy quickly responded.
After.
Was all Collin could say. Tony wanted to ask why. He wanted to hug his new friend and tell him it would be okay. Something in him told him that it wasn't the right time, and he knew it was getting late. So he simply climbed back on the bike and tapped Collin on the shoulder before pointing forward. The bike whipped to the left, putting them on a more northern route. The petals whirred as they left the tiny neighborhood and their small moment of happiness behind. They disappeared over a hill, clouded in the ashy smoke that brought them back to the world they truly lived in. By the end of the following day, they found themselves rolling down Burke Street in Rhodus, South Carolina. The light was fading, and they decided to take refuge in a small Dollar General store. As usual, Collin swept the property before allowing Tony to come inside. The two of them scoured the aisles for any supplies. Most of the good canned food had been taken, but they were able to find a few bags of dry beans. Collin found a first aid kit, and Tony waved a few flashlights that still worked down the aisle to his friend. This meant they did not have to spend another night in the dark, at least until the batteries ran out. They barricaded themselves in the manager's office and gorged themselves on the snack cakes that had not gone stale. It was the closest to a birthday party they were going to get. But it was just as good as long as they were together. When they emerged in the morning, Collin removed his map and showed Tony the route they would have to take. It would put them crossing a bridge, which he hated to do, but it would save them the hours it would take to go around. They mounted their bicycle and quickly descended on the bridge. Their eyes fell on the crumpled remains of the landing, and what was once a passage across the lake now lay in the water. The two slowly descended to the docks, looking up and down the shore to look for another bridge. Tony hopped off the bike and ran down the shore a bit, pointing toward what appeared to be a dam in the distance. He waved to Collin, drawing his attention to their salvation. A smile grew on Collin's face. He really did not want to have to go back and around the water. The bike began to roll forward as Tony came running back. The two boys met back at a small building up from the landing and decided to make their way toward the dam. A whistling noise caught Collin's attention, and he stopped the bike just as an arrow struck him in his right shoulder. Tony screamed at the sight and started toward him, but Collin yelled for him to run for cover. Tony dove behind a pile of canoes, and Collin began pedaling as fast as he could. His eyes scanned the buildings as he went, and just before he passed beyond a building, another arrow buried into the wall beside him. His body fell from the seat of the bicycle, and he began crawling behind a storage container. The two boys were only 10 feet from each other, but without knowing where the shots came from, it might as well have been miles. Tony cried into his hands, trying to be silent because Collin had already taught him how important that was. Collin looked down at the shiny projectile that jutted from his jacket, the red having quickly dyed the cloth around it. He was in immense pain, but he could not let that stop him now. The two of them were still in a lot of danger. Collin tried to peer over the crate, but the roof over him blocked most of his view. He knew the shot must have come from an elevated position, but he could not see any open windows or rooftops. He pointed to Tony, then to his eyes, then back out toward the building across from them. It took the boy a minute to understand, but then he shuffled to the other side of the canoes. Tony inched over one of them and searched the area. An arrow punctured the hull of a nearby boat, which sent Tony diving for the ground. He tried to whisper something, but Collin could not make it out. Then the boy pointed to his eyes, then across the street, and made an arch from his hands that signaled roof. Collin put up his hand, instructed Tony to stay put, then eased around the opposite side of the building. As he approached the opposite corner, he took a quick peek toward the roof. Standing with the bow drawn was a very thin man wearing a hockey mask covered in what appeared to be dried blood. Collin watched the man for a few moments. Seeing that he was still focused on the other side of the building, he moved closer, coming to a small car. He attempted to aim the rifle, but pain pulsed through him when he lifted it. He hoisted the barrel over the trunk of the car with his left arm and tried to steady it as best as he could. His breathing had become erratic, causing the reticle on the scope to jump violently. Collin tried to calm himself. He knew he would only get one shot. The crosshairs swayed from the man's head down to his left arm, which happened to be the one holding the compound bow. His breathing slowed, and when his aim was as steady as he could make it, his finger pulled the trigger. The shot grazed the man's left arm, pieces of his jacket scattering to the wind. He turned and fired an arrow that stuck into the hood of the car in front of Collin. The young man ducked for cover as another arrow was let loose. From the corner of the building, he saw Tony, tears streaming down his face. He had used the shot as a distraction to come help, but Collin was not sure what to do. They both made their way back around the building and moved back further away from their attacker. The building was small and would not hide them for long. The man had them at a disadvantage, and Collin knew this. Plus, he now stood between them and the dam. They would have to eliminate the man, but he was not sure how. As they rounded a side street and attempted to come around to their attacker's left, Collin knelt beside a tree and told Tony to take the rifle. He hesitated, but Collin simply shoved it in the boy's hands. Tony shook his head and tried to hand it back, but Collin resisted.
No, I can't lift it, and if we don't stop this guy, we are dead.
He gasped through his pain.
You have to take the shot, kid.
Tony cried. He had never had to kill anyone and did not want to. Collin could see it in the boy's eyes, and he did not want to have to make this choice. There really was no choice, though, and he began to tell him what to do. He pointed at the bolt, drawing it back and placing a new round in the chamber. He dropped the bolt closed and told him to bring it up to his shoulder. Collin pushed the stock into Tony's shoulder hard.
You've got to have a good grip on this one. It has more kick than the pistol. You're going to want to look through that lens right there, and where the two lines meet is what you are aiming for. You try to calm yourself, line up those crosshairs, then take a deep breath. You pull that trigger as you breathe out slowly, and you will be fine.
The words came rushing back to Collin, just the way they had from his father. Tony crouched and crawled around the tree. He could see the man still searching for them, but only the top half of his body was visible. He rose to his knees, trying to brace himself. Collin stood right behind him, reminding him to try to stay calm. The man turned to look in their direction and came close to that side of the roof. Tony began shaking at his feet, and it traveled through his whole body. Collin rested a hand on his shoulder and promised it would be all right. The crosshairs danced around a bit, and Collin reminded him to shoot for the biggest part of the man's body he could see. When the two lines intersected over the man's stomach, Tony let out a sigh and pulled the trigger. The two found their way to a church nearby, and Tony sat on a pew as Collin dropped his bag beside him. He told Tony that he needed him to break the back end of the arrow and pull it out. Tony hesitated, but Collin insisted, handing him a thick towel. He told him to break the end off, remove it, and cover the wound with the towel, stressing the fact that he would need to press hard. Tony was still shaking, but he knew his friend was right. He had seen all this in the movies, but he wasn't sure if he was strong enough. The shaft cracked and broke free, causing Collin to scream out in agony. They both removed the halves of the arrow and covered each side with a towel.
What happened to Danny, Collin?
Tony's voice was low, his hope dwindling.
I told you, he died.
But how, Collin? How did he die?
Tony pushed harder for the answer. Collin couldn't take it anymore. He had almost gotten both of them killed, and now he couldn't even lift his rifle. His body jerked from his sobs, unable to hold back anymore. Tony immediately felt horrible for even asking, but was not sure what to say. He simply kept pressing the towel against Collin's shoulder, which was soaked with blood by now. Collin paused, the words not wanting to come.
I couldn't protect him.
Tony listened as a story was told about two young boys playing in an old cornfield. The land had long been without a harvest, his family no longer sowing the seeds. It had been a dream of his grandfather's, and once he was gone, no one saw the need. His parents placed their little mobile home on the land to keep his grandmother company. She enjoyed having her grandchildren so close. The boys would spend their evenings and weekends playing in the field and down in the trees behind it. That was until the fall. His parents had died trying to protect them. They did not have a shelter, but all huddled in the center bathroom of his grandmother's two-story house. The two boys had been placed inside a large cast-iron tub, and both parents had lain down on top of them. This was the best shield they had as the heavens rained down on them. When the commotion ended, Collin had to force his parents off of himself and his brother. The medicine cabinet had come crashing down with such force, it had jabbed into their father's skull, and shards of glass protruded from their mother's neck. Danny cried relentlessly as Collin searched for their grandmother. She had lost hope, and they found her body lying outside, still clutching a picture of her late husband. The weeks that followed, Collin could not grieve his parents. He had to be strong for his brother. He dragged him along while collecting things they would need to travel. His first plan was to make his way to his other grandparents' house, which was in a town nearby. It would be a long walk, but he had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. He had already tried 2 neighbors' homes, but they had all attempted to flee. Their cars sat lifeless a few miles down the road. He shielded Danny's eyes as they passed. They came to the yard of their bus driver, who had his shotgun in hand. A young woman clutched a can of soup and begged for help. Collin pulled Danny away as the gun fired and the woman fell to the ground. That was the last time he approached people. Their father taught them to move at night. That way you were less likely to be seen. That might have worked during combat situations, but this was a different world. It was only a week into the 2 boys being alone when the bandits found them. A group of middle-aged men and women had been searching for food and weapons. They took Danny first, and Collin drew his father's pistol. It vibrated in his hands. He'd never had to use it outside target practice, and he was not sure if he could kill someone. He aimed it and ordered them to let Danny go, but they refused. Before he could react, they tossed his screaming little brother in the back seat of a car and sped off. The shots of the pistol pelted the back of the vehicle, but it was no use. Danny was gone.
So, you see,
Collin looked back to Tony with tears in his eyes.
I couldn't protect him. I can't protect you. And I obviously can't save myself.
Tony hugged his friend as best as he could without releasing pressure on the towel.
It's not your fault, Collin. We're just kids. You did the best you could. Hell, you've saved me twice already.
Yeah, but that doesn't bring Danny back.
Well, you said they took him. How do you know he's dead?
You know firsthand what happens to kids that have no use in this world.
He replied with a cold stare, and Tony knew it was true. They both sat quietly. Collin cried himself to sleep, and Tony sat up, watching over him for hours. Over the next month, Collin made it his mission to teach Tony everything he knew. They both read from the survival guide and the Bible at night. They even found a small home library that offered more information on foraging and handcrafted items. Tony even picked out a few books for entertainment value, but Collin was firm on training each day. While Collin healed, Tony became more adept at the world they now lived in. And soon, Collin felt safe with him by his side. They could protect one another, like brothers should, which always made Collin a little sad. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of tonight's chilling tale. After the Fall, Part 2 by the talented Locked 334. I hope you've enjoyed our descent into darkness, and that you'll carry a piece of the Fear File Chronicles with you as you drift into uneasy dreams. If our story left you shivering and shaking, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who crave a good scare, and subscribe to the Fear File Chronicles for more haunting horrors. Remember to hit the bell notification, so you're always among the first to know when a new nightmare awaits. As always, we appreciate your support and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing your fears and frights with us truly means a lot, so don't be shy to engage with our sinister community. Until next time, remember to embrace the darkness, for it is within the shadows that our most terrifying stories are born. Good night, and stay scared.